This evening, I think we have a rare opportunity to listen to someone who has a great deal of experience with President Nixon and with the First Lady. I don't want to go into any details because if I do, I think I will spoil her presentation. So at this time, I would like to introduce Chris Holliday.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me here to share my memories of Mrs. Nixon, one of my very favorite ladies, and my memories of President Nixon. On this year of Mrs. Nixon's centennial, memories came flooding back to me. On one hand, so many very special and wonderful, joyful memories. And on the other hand, so many intensely painful memories in San Clemente. I had the privilege to work for President and Mrs. Nixon in several different capacities, starting as a White House military social aide, then as a member of the East Wing staff, and finally as a member of the presidential transition staff in San Clemente. How, as a naval officer in Washington, D.C., did I have the privilege of working at the White House? I have Mrs. Nixon to thank. I was a lieutenant in the Navy, single and newly assigned to Capitol Hill as a congressional reporter for the Navy. And all I heard from the minute I got there was about the most coveted and prestigious program that a single military officer could do in Washington, and that was to be a White House military social aide. Each officer kept his day job, whether it was at the Pentagon or Capitol Hill or whatever, and then he would work functions and events at the White House. So his day job, he kept his day job and worked at the White House on other occasions. And every single male military officer in Washington aspired to this elite cadre of about 30 officers. The first family had relied on these military social aides since the program was instituted in the 1880s by Grover Cleveland. And it makes perfect sense that any president and first lady could not possibly host up to 250 guests at a time by themselves. So, of course, they need assistant hosts. And my timing was perfect. Mrs. Nixon had just opened up the program to women officers. So I applied, and I was on pins and needles for over a year. It took that long to complete the rigorous background security checks. As the security process unfolded, I became increasingly aware of how thorough the White House was in checking out new employees. One by one, friends and neighbors, old and new, started to call me up and ask me if I was in trouble because federal agents had been around asking questions about me. The questions were even more intimate than the ones that they had asked me to my face. They concerned anything and everything about my lifestyle and my habits. Eventually, this clandestine activity subsided, or at least reports my friends. And still nothing happened. I waited weeks and nothing happened. And finally the call came. The clearance was complete and approved. I could come down to the White House to get my pass, my social aid manual, and my presidential aguillettes. So they're old and falling apart, but they're a treasure. So it took them exactly 1 year to clear me, and I was at the White House in 20 minutes after I got the call. And the date was 7 August 1972. And there I was, one of the very first women in the U.S. Navy to be a White House military social aide. I felt prepared for this honor because my job as a congressional reporter required me to recognize every congressman, every senator, every cabinet member, and every VIP in Washington. And in this regard, my job dovetailed perfectly with the White House job. I thought meeting the colorful politicians on Capitol Hill was a thrilling job, but it did not compare to the prestigious and influential people that I would meet at the White House. Military social aides acted, and still do, as assistant hosts to the President and First Lady at all the social and military events at the White House. We were in charge of escorting guests into and out of the White House, introducing guests to the President and First Lady, crowd control, dancing and chatting, and sometimes drinking a glass of champagne with the guests, to name but a few duties. My boss, the social secretary, was Lucy Winchester. I think you've all seen her interview. Over her years in the White House, she had perfected a surefire technique for crowd control, as she called it, and that was helping guests reluctant to leave a White House party to actually leave. So, no one wanted to leave. So it was our very first job as social aides to learn how to do this, and she called it the turkey trot. And it was a simple procedure. As aides, we simply placed ourselves in front of the guest, strategically in front of them, all the time moving closer to the exit door. And instinctively, the guest would back up to protect his or her body space. And magically, working together, in less than a few minutes, we could clear an entire room of guests. The second thing I remember learning from Lucy was how to fold a napkin at the conclusion of a state dinner. This was in case a guest would ask if he was unfamiliar with White House protocol. And I love to do this. You don't fold it, you do this, and then you lay it down next to your plate. I always love that. We also had what Lucy called wallflower patrol. And this consisted of looking around for people who looked lost or alone at an event, and we were to go up and engage them in small talk or dance with them or whatever was necessary. The perks of being an aide, besides working for a wonderful first family, were many. Meeting the diverse array of fascinating people, some important, some not, that streamed through the White House almost daily, was high on the list. But so was the food that came out of the White House kitchen. After a certain point in every function, we were allowed to take off our white gloves and indulge in the goodies. The brownies, the strawberry tarts, and the little shish kebabs were big sellers among the aides. And we even got to eat in the White House mess during a state dinner. The other thing we always had to be on the lookout for was the inclination of certain guests to want to take a White House memento home with them. And these were usually in the form of spoons, knives, or forks, and something that could easily be slipped into their pocket. So our MO for handling this kind of behavior was simply to say, "Sir, I think something that does not belong to you has fallen by mistake into your pocket." And they would very sheepishly pull it back out and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it was a mistake." So, how did I first meet the president? My career as an aide had a rocky start. At my first state dinner, I was the pull-off aide for the receiving line. For a state dinner, the receiving line is always in the East Room, and then the guests are guided down the grand hall of the White House into the state dining room, and there they are seated. My post was at the right hand of the president, and I was responsible for keeping the receiving line moving in a timely fashion and directing the guests to the dining room. Then my job was to stand at the door of the dining room and make sure all the guests were seated before the president and first lady came down. So I was standing in front of the door at the state dining room looking at the guests, and I heard someone come up behind me, or I felt or sensed someone come up behind me, and I turned around, and it was the president. And my badge, Pat for First Lady. Anyway, so I turned around and I was in complete shock. So an automatic reflex, I stuck out my hand like I was the president and he was the guest. Anyway, he shook my hand and he said, "Oh, Lieutenant, you look so very nice tonight." And his eyes twinkled and he shook my hand. And I gained notoriety that night as the only military social aide to have shaken the hand of the president under these inappropriate circumstances. Because good aides are expected to be inconspicuous, almost invisible. The attention must never be on an aide. And I learned later that all the other seasoned aides laid bets on how long it would take for me to be fired. It was not long after when Vice President Agnew resigned, and I had another close call on the occasion of the swearing in of Vice President Ford in December of 1973. It was a daytime function in the East Room, and it was the very first televised event that I had ever worked. And I was in charge of seating the first two rows in protocol order. And everybody was seated but Dr. Kissinger, who was still standing in the aisle chatting with a pretty woman, as sometimes he liked to do. I had less than 1 minute before the television cameras were going to roll, and I thought, oh my goodness, I have a choice. I'll either be fired by the social secretary for not doing my job, or I could be fired by Dr. Kissinger for annoying him. So I took a deep breath and I grabbed his forearm, and with gentle force I pushed him into his chair. And arriving home that afternoon, I thought sure I would be fired. That was it. The last White House event I had ever worked. So I went home, and calls from all around the country came in from all my friends, and they said, "Oh, we saw you shaking hands with Dr. Kissinger. Congratulations!" So I squeaked through another tense moment. And it was then that I developed my policy for success, and it's simply to make your mistakes when no one important is there to see them.